Hope that you're doing well on this Wednesday, whether it be morning or evening, whenever you are watching this. We hope that you are doing well and looking forward to our study together. If you have your Bible, go ahead and open to 2 Kings chapter 3. That's where we'll begin tonight and try and work our way through this chapter. We've, of course, been studying. We finished 1 Kings. We moved our way into 2 Kings, and we're watching the establishment of the ministry of Elisha. And the last time we were together a couple of Wednesday nights ago in person, we talked about how Elisha was being established as the successor of Elijah. We see that process take place in chapter 2 when Elijah is taken into heaven, and then Elisha takes his mantle, that is the mantle of Elijah, and crosses over the Jordan River. And the sons of the prophets, that's those schools of prophets, they saw him, and Elisha was confirmed in their eyes because they saw what had happened, the transference of power, so to speak. And then he goes to the city of Jericho, and he is confirmed as a prophet there, and his authority is seen because he is able to take a city that had been cursed previously, and now he's able to bless it and make the water very drinkable, and it becomes an important city in the New Testament era itself. And then, of course, he goes to Bethel, and there it seems, what can seem at first glance like a bizarre story. He pronounces a curse upon the individuals who are harassing him. And there's a lot more to it that meets the eye. And we talked about that in greater detail, so we won't go into that. But it's again confirming his prophetic ministry, first of all, to the sons of the prophets, and then to the people in the city of Jericho, and then to the people who were lost in idolatry in Bethel that was totally against God. And now in chapter 3, we see another level of that confirmation. That is, he's going to be confirmed as the prophet to go to the kings. And we're going to have the king of the north and the king of the south come to him together along with the king of Edom, and his word will be established. And then after chapter 3, we're going to get into a cluster of miracles that are recorded that will also help to confirm his ministry. So let's begin here in 2 Kings chapter 3. This is a battle between Moab and the king of Israel, the king of Judah, and the king of Edom, who also enters the story very secretly. It seems like it kind of appears out of nowhere. So in chapter 3, verse 1, it says, in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, Jehoram, the son of Ahab, became king over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 12 years. And we've seen some of this. You remember Ahaziah, when we looked at chapter 1, Ahaziah had fallen and he had died. He took over for Ahab initially, and then when he died, Jehoram took over for him as the king of Israel. So still a son, a descendant of Ahab. Now, of course, the house of Ahab has been cursed and it's going to be cut off, but that won't take place for several more years and a couple more chapters as far as our study is concerned. Now, this is the summation of him, and this is how God judges all of these kings. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, though not like his father and mother, for he put away the pillar of Baal or Baal that his father had made. Okay, so he's certainly an evil king, but he does not take it to the level that his father did. He put Baal away. Okay, you remember as we saw that Israel was declining, you had the introduction of calf worship in 1 Kings chapter 12 at the end of it by Jeroboam the son of Nebat, the first king of the 10 northern tribes. And then with Ahab, he introduced Baal worship, which was a whole nother level of idolatry. Now, what we see here with his son is that he does not go after Baal. Okay, but verse 3, nevertheless, he clung to the sin of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin, and he did not depart from it. Now, this idea of clinging to the calf worship of Jeroboam, this word is used in Genesis 2 to describe the joining together of a husband and wife. In Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 20, it's used to describe God's commitment to Israel. And so he is wholly committed to Jeroboam and his idolatry. And so he's a wicked king, but maybe not to the level of his father, but he does not follow Baal. Now, what we know is that he tolerates Baal worship. Okay, he does tolerate Baal worship. It says he put away the pillar of Baal. Now, there's some debate about what is said here when he says he put away the pillar of Baal, because when we come to the end of Ahab's house, which is executed by Jehu, and we'll see this in chapter 10 of 2 Kings, there the pillar reappears. And so a couple of things are happening. Either number one, he doesn't destroy it in a certain sense. He just simply removes it out of sight and puts it out of commission. And then it's later, Baal worship is later resurrected and restored. And so they go and get that image. Or it could be that he destroyed the image and then they had another one made at a later point. But either way, he is a wicked king. Now, in verse 4, it says, now Mesha, the king of Moab, was a sheep breeder, and he had to deliver to the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But when Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. Okay, so they've been subjugated by the children of Israel, and so they're rebelling against this new king. Now, this is the way actually 2 Kings began. We have one statement, and then it moves on. And we don't learn about it until we come here to chapter 3. But this one statement, 2 Kings 1 and verse 1, after the death of Ahab, Moab rebelled against Israel. And so here we learn more about what that is. Now, obviously, if you're taking out, refusing to deliver 100,000 sheep and then the wool of 100,000 rams, that's a major economic impact. Now, Israel was preoccupied with Aram and Assyria to the north. They weren't as preoccupied with Moab anymore. So the king of Moab thought it's a good time to kind of rebel and test the mettle of this new king, which was also a common thing. When a new king takes the throne, let's see what he's about. Does he have the power? Do we really want to be under his rule or reign? Is this a good time to rebel? And so he seizes this opportunity to do that. Now in verse 6, it says, so King Jehoram marched out of Samaria at that time and mustered all Israel. So Moab has rebelled, so he gets his army ready. Verse 7, and he went and sent word to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And he says this, the king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to battle against Moab? And he said, I will go. I am as you are. My people is your people, and my horses as your horses. Now, this setting should remind you of 1 Kings 22 with Ahab and Jehoshaphat and that whole incident that ultimately led to Ahab's demise and death. But Jehoshaphat utters the same words here, 1 Kings 22 and verse 4, that he did to Jehoram's father Ahab, my people as your people and my horses as your horses. Okay. Then he said, by which way shall we march? Jehoram answered, by the way of the wilderness of Edom. Okay. So Judah, you remember when in 1 Kings 22, there is a connection. There is an intermarriage alliance between the North and the South with these families. And so that could be part of it. We also talked about in 1 Kings 22, the way the language is used there, that it seems like Jehoshaphat was the weaker king in the treaty, okay, or in the alliance. And so it could be that he's imposing his will here. It could be that a stronger Moab could weaken the defenses of the southern tribes of Judah. And so it may be that he has a vested interest in this, that it might be good for his kingdom. Now, the one thing that is different here, Jehoshaphat is going to ask to speak to a prophet in just a few verses in front of us. But what's different here is in 1 Kings 22, he asked to speak to a prophet of God before they ever went to war. In this chapter, he does not ask to speak to a prophet until after they've kind of gotten themselves into trouble. And so it tells you something about Jehoshaphat, who is an up and down character. He has really good characteristics and he makes some monumentally bad mistakes. And so he's kind of one of those mixture kings. He's not really evil, but he's not necessarily everything that he should be either. He's kind of an in-between. So they're going to war, and the plan is to go south by the way of Edom. Now, if you look on a map, and you can pull this up, obviously, if you're watching this, you've probably got some kind of a mobile device, and you can Google maps of Palestine and things along those lines in the days of the kings, and you'll see this. So Moab, the most common sense way to get to Moab, if you're just traveling there, is to cross over the Jordan River, and Moab is just across in the Transjordan and there to go to battle. But Moab had built fortified cities in those places to protect themselves, obviously. So what they propose to do is to go through the way of Edom. Now, that's, a little bit out of the way. When you look at this map, it will go all the way down. Okay, so from the north and the south, you're going all the way down through Judah, and then you're going down from the bottom of the Red Sea, or the bottom of the Dead Sea, I should say, and then you're going up, and then you're coming up to Moab. And so it's kind of what he's suggesting is a sneak attack. They won't see it coming because we're coming from the backside instead of the front side where they would expect us to attack from. And so that's kind of the plan of this particular battle. Verse 9, so the king of Israel went with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. Now, again, we said the king of Edom just kind of slips in here. We're not necessarily told about his entrance, most likely based upon 1 Kings 22:48 and some of the business transactions of one of the sons of Ahab and some of the others of Jehoshaphat. It seems that Edom was also a subjugated nation. They were not necessarily in an alliance. They were the weaker party in paying tribute and basically under the rule of the nation of Judah. And so here he is, and he joins them. And it says when they had made a route, gone in circles, okay, made a route on a march of 7 days, 130 miles, basically. It says there was no water for the army or for the animals that followed them. Obviously a huge problem. Then the king of Israel said, alas, the Lord has called these 3 kings to give them into the hand of Moab. Okay. So the king of Israel, this is Jehoram, who is an idolater that we've already seen. He does not worship God, does not worship Yahweh. He says, this is the work of God. He's brought us out here to kill us, which reminds you of the wilderness wanderings and the things that they would say. Now in verse 11, Jehoshaphat said, is there no prophet of the Lord here through whom we may inquire of the Lord? So now he wants to seek a prophet. Now that we're in this situation, now he's wanting to seek a prophet, and he's kind of got things out of order, obviously. So then it says, then one of the kings of Israel's servants answered, Elisha, the son of Shaphat, is here, who poured water over the hands of Elijah. To pour water over the hands, there's a couple of different ideas behind that. Most likely it has to do with the fact that Elisha was Elijah's servant. Obviously his protege, they had a close relationship, but to pour water over the hands, there was this. And so what they're saying is there's this close relationship that existed between Elijah and Elisha. And he's kind of the new guy. He's the new Elijah on the scene. And Jehoshaphat said, the word of the Lord is with him. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. Now, where this is, we don't know. Okay. There's nothing in the text that indicates its location, where Elisha was when they came to him. Verse 13, and Elisha said to the king of Israel, what have I to do with you? Go to the prophets of your father and to the prophets of your mother. But the king of Israel said to him, no, it is the Lord who has called these 3 kings to give them into the hand of Moab. And so when Elisha sees Jehoram, he says, what are you doing here? You and your family have wreaked havoc on Israel. You don't want anything I've got to say. You didn't want anything that my predecessor had to say in Elijah. Why are you here? Go inquire of your own prophets. If they're so great and they're so perfect and they're worthy of your worship and allegiance, go after them. Go ask them. And Jehoram says, no, Yahweh has led us out here, and this is what is happening. So verse 14, Elisha said, as the Lord of hosts lives before whom I stand, which was a similar phrase that Elijah used in 1 Kings 17 and some other places. Were it not that I have regard for Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, I would neither look at you nor see you. And so he's just reinforcing to him, the only reason I'm even talking to you is because he's here. And he is a decent man. He's not a perfect king, but he's a decent king. He's a good man. So he says this, verse 15, but now bring me a musician. And when the musician played, the hand of the Lord came upon him. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 10, verses 5 through 11, you see something similar. We have to be careful here. This is not the idea of superstition and, we have to get the music right and then God will appear. It was a calming, soothing thing, and then God would communicate to the prophet. It wasn't some kind of mystical formula. It was just something that was done to kind of calm the situation. Of course, Elisha is obviously very upset. He's kind of had some strong language for Jehoram. And so he's just wanting to cool down a little bit, and God will reveal himself, which is not uncommon to do so in this particular area. Verse 16, it says, and he said, thus says the Lord, I will make this dry stream bed full of pools. Okay. I will make this dry stream bed full of pools. For thus says the Lord, you shall not see wind or rain, but the stream bed shall fill with water, so that you shall drink, you, your livestock, and your animals. This is a light thing in the sight of the Lord. So first of all, he says, I'm going to solve your problem with water. I'm going to fill these beds that are empty. I'm going to fill them with water, but you're not going to see rain. You're not going to see clouds. You're not going to see, you're not going to be able to explain this by a natural phenomenon. Okay. You're not going to be able to look at it and say, oh, well, it wasn't really God. The rain just kind of came and filled it up. He said, I'm going to make water appear in these places, and you're going to understand and know my power by that. And then he goes on to say this is a light thing in the sight of the Lord. This is easy. Okay. Now, for God, it certainly is easy, but we should stand back and look at it in awe that in the middle of a desert, God can make water just appear. Okay, now that's easy for him. That's what he's saying. And he's trying, this is a gracious encounter. He's trying to get Jehoram's attention in a certain way. And certainly Jehoshaphat's as well, and the king of Edom. So he, first of all, solves the problem with water. Then he says this at the second part of verse 18, he will also give the Moabites into your hand, and you shall attack every fortified city and every choice city, and shall fell every good tree and stop up all the springs of water and ruin every good piece of land with stones. Okay. So I'm also going to give you Moab. I'm not just going to solve your problem with water. I'm also going to give you the king of Moab, which is what you're here for. And so God is being gracious and pouring one gift on top of the other. And so he says, attack the Moabites, get their fortified cities, break down their defenses, and you shall fell every good tree. That is, you cut down every good tree. Obviously, this would have environmental effects. Not having trees in certain places, the shade, the topsoil, things along those lines would make it difficult, would put some damage onto the topsoil according to certain individuals and the studies that they have done. And so in this environment, it would have environmental effects as well. And so then he says, I want you to stop up all the springs of water. Okay. That is, fill them up and make the water difficult for the people to access. And then I want you to ruin every good piece of land with stones. That is, when you tear apart these fortified cities, I want you to take these stones and just put them on the ground everywhere. Okay. So what this is doing is it's crippling the economy and consuming their time. Number one, it's taking away their defenses. Number two, they're going to be able to restore their water sources, but not without a lot of work in the process. And number three, in these fields, scattering stones, you got to pick up all these stones, and that's going to take a long time to pick up all those stones and then to be able to farm them. And then the environmental damage that's taking place from the trees, it's just crippling them, is basically what God wants to happen. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 19 and 20, where God spoke concerning some warfare tactics and the way he wanted things handled. One of the things that he forbade was that you don't just cut down any tree for any reason. And so there are some things there. I would encourage you to look at that text and think through some of its implications with what's going on here. Then in verse 20, it says, the next morning, about the time of the offering of the sacrifice, behold, water came from the direction of Edom till the country was filled with water. And so God produces this water for them. Okay. Now, verse 21, when all the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them, all who were able to put on armor, from the youngest to the oldest, were called out and were drawn up at the border. So Edom obviously realizes that they have come in a kind of a sneak attack, and so they go out to meet them. Verse 22, and when they rose early in the morning and the sun shone on the water, the Moabites saw the water opposite them as red as blood. Notice, it was not red, it was not blood. That's how they saw it. That's the appearance of it. And they said, this is blood. The kings have surely fought together and struck one another down. Now then, Moab to the spoil. So they thought that this was just, it indicated bloodshed. And if you've ever studied any military history or things along those lines, it's a gruesome scene, but in battle, especially when you're invading a beach or something along those lines, you think about D-Day. June 6th of 1944, when they're storming the beaches at Normandy. And the individuals who lost their lives, the water that turned red in that vicinity because of the amount of bloodshed in that particular reason, or that particular region. And so that's kind of what they're assuming here. There's been a lot of bloodshed, so this will be easy. We can just finish them off. But verse 24, it says, but when they came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose and struck the Moabites till they fled before them, and they went forward, striking the Moabites as they went. And so it's kind of luring them in. The Israelites were waiting on them. And so this is God's deliverance to them. Verse 25, and they overthrew the cities, and on every good piece of land, every man threw a stone until it was covered. And they stopped up every spring of water, and felled all the good trees till only its stones were left in Kir Harseth. Now, Kir Harseth was the capital at this particular time. And it says, and the slingers surrounded and attacked it. So they basically conquered all of Moab. They're just trying to get the capital city, the last fortified city. You could have villages and other things, but not fortified, didn't have walls. And then it says the slingers surrounded it and attacked it. Now, the slingers has reference to slingshots, slinging stones. I mean, you look at what David accomplished in 1 Samuel chapter 17 with a slingshot. I mean, the speed, we think of a slingshot sometimes like Dennis the Menace. What kind of damage could it really do? That's not what this is. This is slinging a rock, and it's slinging it at an incredibly fast pace that can do real damage to you if you're hit by it. Again, see Goliath. But this was a common part of warfare. Judges chapter 20 and verse 16, you had the left-handed individuals who could sling a rock at a hair and not miss, is what the text says. Or 2 Chronicles 26 and verse 14, where it talks about Uzziah, that as king of Judah, he was building up their military in certain areas, and one of the things he did was providing stones for the slingers. And so according to most things that I've been able to see, these slingers would stand behind the archers, and they would hurl their stones. So verse 26, when the king of Moab saw that the battle was going against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through opposite the king of Edom, but they could not. So he's just going to try and make his escape, but they're repelled. Verse 27, then he took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. A burnt offering to Chemosh, most likely, the abomination of the Ammonites and the Moabites, Chemosh and Molech. And so we're not told how old this son is who is to reign in his place, but he offers him as a human sacrifice to seek to get the God's approval, or not even their approval is not the right word, to seek to get their favor so that they might rescue him in the midst of this difficulty, because he thinks he's about to lose and die. And so he offers his son as a sacrifice. And there came great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. Now, remember a couple of weeks ago when we just introduced this chapter, we said that it's kind of an open-ended, strange ending. It says there came great wrath against Israel. There's tons of debate about what is meant here. Was it the Moabites? They saw that the king had sacrificed his son, and so they were just inspired by that, and they went after Israel and they attacked them very hard. Some translations and some understandings of this would say that the people of Israel were moved with wrath, and so basically so disgusted that they just kind of walked away and went home and said, I don't want to, we're done here. To be honest with you, I don't know. I don't know. But there came great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew from him, and they returned to their own land. Now, this ending reminds us a little bit of 1 Kings chapter 20. You remember in that particular context, in 1 Kings chapter 20, Ahab went to war with Syria, Ben-Hadad, and defeated him. And instead of finishing the job and killing Ben-Hadad and all those things, he struck a deal with him and ended up receiving a punishment by God, or a prophetic oracle of his punishment by God for his failure to execute the plan. And so at the very least, what you see is a failure on behalf of Israel and Judah to follow through with God's plan. God had already said that he was going to give them the Moabites. And either because Moab started to put up a little harder fight, or Israel got disgusted and walked away, either way, they didn't finish the job. They didn't do what God said. They didn't trust the promise of God to give them Moab, and they stopped before the job was done. And that's what we have to think about. Trigger reflection in our own lives, that we think about finishing the job that God has given to us, following through, trusting his promises, even when the battle presses in harder, or even when we may be disgusted and just tired of fighting. We have to continue through and finish the job. But either way, Elisha in this text is shown and confirmed to be the new prophet in Israel, the leading prophet. Of course, there were plenty of prophets in Israel at the time, but he is considered to be the leader of that particular group. So as we think about this chapter, we're learning that Elisha is to be taken seriously, that God is speaking through him. And as we think about ourselves, we need to really think about finishing what it is God has called us to do, and trusting in his promises all the way to the end. Otherwise, it can lead to our own ruin. And eventually that's what will happen to the nation of Israel.